Hello, in this video, I'm going to be talking about psychodynamic family theory as well as Bowen Family Systems Theory. So to start out with psychodynamic family theory, well, I'm actually going to draw the information from Gladding, his 2019 text titled Family Therapy, History, Theory, and Practice, the 7th edition, as well as some videos that are posted by psychotherapy.net by David Scharf and Jill Savage Scharf. They do a demonstration of psychodynamic theory, as well as Philip Guerin does a demonstration and talks about Bowen family systems theory. So those are kind of the sources of where I'm drawing this information. But in the Gladding text, it talks about how both of these theories are transgenerational theories. So meaning that in the text on page 212, transgenerational family therapies examine the interactions of families across generations as a way to understand current problems and predict future challenges. So that's pretty unique about these theories. You know, not all family systems theories look at generations and patterns and traditions and rules and roles that have kind of played out through multiple generations. So these ones really emphasize that transgenerational process. So I just wanted to highlight that first before going into each. So to start with psychodynamic. Psychodynamic really has historically been just about the unconscious, how to make the unconscious more conscious. Like that's obviously really distilling down the process and the various approaches, psychodynamic approaches. Like obviously Freud's approach was a little bit different than the object relations, but they still are fitting underneath psychodynamic. But the idea is that earlier in life, certain needs haven't been met. And so then it's kind of started this unconscious process that's unhelpful. And in order to get out of that unhelpful process, we need to make that unconscious more conscious and make that need that hasn't been met. So with psychodynamic family systems theory, it's basically like how to help that family unit work through their unconscious processes so that they can be freed from them, freed from being trapped. So some of the techniques that are used is transference and countertransference reactions. Some theories view transference and countertransference as almost like a negative thing, but in psychodynamic, transference and countertransference is expected, it's normal, it's actually a central part of the work, is to use the counselor can use their transference reactions to be like more present with the client. Obviously, they're not going to impose their experience, but they're going to be really thoughtful of how they're feeling towards the client and maybe where that's coming from. And if it's worth sharing to like kind of help bring that unconscious process to the surface. And the counselor might help the client work through their transference reactions. Like, for example, a transference reaction could be projection. So the client could be projecting their experience onto the counselor or onto someone else. So they're transferring, in a sense, their reactions towards themselves onto someone else. So it's almost like they do that to kind of involve others in making sense of their inner hurt. So Gladding talked about, the quote that he said is, it helps them to tolerate their own painful intrapsychic states of mind, to project. So the counselor could then notice that projection. Okay, that projection may be occurring. So then they might interpret it. So interpretation in psychodynamic is usually just bringing the unconscious to consciousness. So it sometimes is a risk or a leap by the counselor to kind of say, okay, how can I share this tentative possibility, of an interpretation of what's really going on at a deeper level, of that unconscious level. So the client, so for example, the David Scharf and Jill Scharf met with a family, and they were working. There's 3 individuals: the partners, the parents, and a child, and the 30-year-old child who was living with them still, or daughter who was living with them. But they had a child who died by suicide earlier, and the counselors really saw the death by suicide of the child as central to the process in the family, that they're trying to grieve that loss and make sense of that loss, and kind of trapping the daughter into the role of that son who had died by suicide, almost to like relieve their anxiety. So that was the interpretation of the counselors. And the family kind of reacted differently to that. seemed like there was a struggle to really want to face that possibility. But that's, once again, interpretation was the counselor directly addressing that possible unconscious process. And then confrontation can be a big part of psychodynamic as well. But confrontation doesn't just have to be like an abrasive confrontation that sometimes we think of with confrontation. It's almost more of like, at least in the Glading text, Glading referenced it more as like a self-confrontation. If you see an inconsistency between, it could be between the value of the client and then their behavior, that they're not aligning that, just noting that and saying, hey, you're saying that you value this and then acting in this way. So just kind of putting that contradiction on the table allows the client to self-confront. So those are a few techniques, not an exhaustive list, but a few ideas of that can be important in psychodynamic family theory. The role of the counselor could look like, and this is from the Glading text, it could look like a teacher. So the counselor might be kind of teaching about unconscious processes and how they would play out through time, and unconscious needs that haven't been met. The counselor could be like a catalyst, kind of trying to push the family clients to motion. It's almost like the family's on the top of the hill and they need to be pushed into motion to be able to get moving and making sense of it. So the counselor might kind of see, how can I kind of push along this client to get moving and to start working on the issues that they need to. And this other idea is of the good enough parent. So one idea from psychodynamic is that oftentimes, and from object relations, is that our early needs sometimes haven't been met. So early childhood needs haven't been met, and so then we're kind of stuck. We haven't worked through those developmental stages or those milestones or those needs. So then the role for the counselor is to become almost like a pseudo parent. It's almost like a child who's held as a baby and nourished and fed and protected, kept safe, kept comforted, kept warm. That holding is really important. So almost metaphorically, the counselor holds the family, keeps them warm, keeps them protected, keeps them nourished, so that they can work through some of those unmet needs, through some of those unconscious processes. So it's almost like, if the family can be held and nurtured in the way it needs to, that doesn't mean never challenging, but it means like kind of, the holding space, the holding environment can make it so they can withstand the challenge. Then they can be moved like the catalyst, and they can be propelled along in their growth and development. So in the end, obviously, this theory is pretty unique in that it focuses on those unconscious loyalties, those invisible loyalties. Other approaches may do that, but obviously that's pretty central and foundational to psychodynamic. Also, the use of defense mechanisms. I think it's worth, really, if this approach is somewhat resonating with you, to really look through what are those defense mechanisms, because the defense mechanisms are usually a defense of the unconscious. The unconscious, there's something of pain or challenge or difficulty that's being hidden, and the defense mechanisms keep the status quo in line. So it could, a big part of using defense mechanisms could be to interpret them as such and to confront the client and interpret them so that the client can say, oh, what's behind this defense mechanism? So as well, the historical origins of dysfunction is a line from Glading's text on page 220. That's another kind of unique factor in this approach in psychodynamic, is you kind of can see the transgenerational, like the family inherited that certain needs haven't been met as a child, and that could be, if not addressed or resolved, then it can be passed on to the next generations. So I've seen a family who had, the men really seem to have difficulty in connecting with their spouses and their children. And that seemed to kind of play out through multiple generations. And, it almost seemed that there was kind of like a mask was put up, and just like an appearance that things were okay, but it really wasn't. So emotions weren't fully expressed, and kind of the give and take and like an authentic, intimate exchange seemed or appeared to be kind of difficult to occur for this family. And that seemed to be playing out. So that's one example of like a transgenerational pattern. And maybe some protections of like, oh, it's maybe not safe to, be intimate. Maybe that's like one of those ideas or an unmet need of like, when I tried to be intimate, it was shut down. So those are some ideas for psychodynamic. Once again, this is an overview, not an exhaustive list of, discussion of the content of this theory, but that's the intro for psychodynamics. So Bowen's theory. So Bowen often focused, and Philip Guerin talked about this in his demonstration video on psychotherapy.net about the importance of triangles, individuals, and dyads. So the focus would often be, sometimes just on each individual unit or member of the family, but sometimes, the counselor would focus on the triangles that were occurring, the triangulation, that maybe there's the parents who had some friction that they need to work on, but then they would displace it onto a child. And so really the dyad needed to be focused on, but the triangle was holding them back from that dyadic exchange. So Philip Guerin kind of talked about how it's like weaving together a tapestry of the individual dynamics, the dyads, the triangles, into a fabric that was allowing you to see the fuller dimension of the family. Some other important kind of unique factors in Bowen is the focus on differentiation. And differentiation can be seen, according to this theory, in two different ways. So the first is like being differentiated from the family. So it's almost like individuating. So for example, if emotions are, or I guess, being able to stay in contact when emotions are high. So that's one idea that Philip Guerin talked about, that, someone who's differentiated from the family isn't enmeshed, isn't fused in the family. So they're not dependent upon others to remain functioning. So it's like they can be removed enough from the family to kind of function independently, but also still stay in contact, still stay connected with the family. So that's usually a pretty big goal for Bowenian theory, is to focus on that differentiation, to, disconnect enough while still remaining connected. The other form of differentiation, and sometimes they're talked about like these differentiation is exchanged back and forth, so it can get kind of confusing. But the other form of differentiation is being able to differentiate the intellect from the affect, so the cognitive from the emotive. So this doesn't mean that cognitive functionings are more valued than emotions. I kind of had that experience at times reading about this theory, and that was kind of off-putting to me. But it's really just saying, can the family client or the individual members of the family deeply think about how they feel, so that they're not trapped in emotional reactivity? So that's the main idea, is that emotional reactiveness can lead to just like a negative cycle, a negative circle, a circular causal factor, or I guess pattern to be developed. So differentiation can we deeply be able to think about our families, or about our emotions, about how we feel? Can we, disconnect enough and accept our reactions enough without being caught up into them? So obviously intergenerational patterns are really focused upon in this theory as well. Especially like some things that are important to note is just like fused relationships. You might notice that like maybe a grandfather and a son were fused, like they're really connected. They were really dependent. They couldn't separate from one another, or other family members might have been cut off. Maybe there's an estranged part of the family that has no contact whatsoever. So noticing dynamics similar to that and relational patterns throughout history can help the individuals currently know, how might these dynamics be playing out currently, and how might they be starting to be transmitted to the next generation as well? So obviously techniques of this theory is, using the genogram to notice those intergenerational patterns. So the genogram being that visual depiction, that family tree, to be able to notice what are those relationships and those dynamics. A couple other ones, once again, not an exhaustive list, but just kind of get you thinking of some kind of unique techniques, is this idea of going home again. So Bowen talked about, and he actually did it himself, is, when you start to get some awareness and some insight into family patterns and intergenerational patterns, that some of those patterns need to be resolved and worked through in order to not kind of continue to have that system and that circular process continuing. So he would sometimes encourage, clients to go home and have conversations with family to when appropriate, to work through those issues. And like I said, he actually did that himself. He went home and worked through issues with his family. And he was kind of saying that the idea of that is to like help you be differentiated enough to be able to have that conversation. And I've seen that going home again can even be metaphorical. Even family members who have passed away and died and who aren't here anymore, and living family members who have some unresolved or unfinished business with that person, almost can still, either through journaling, share those thoughts, go home again emotionally to kind of process those. Like I've seen people use the idea of the empty chair technique to say out loud as if that person was there, even though they've died, to kind of work through those unresolved feelings. So going home again could be an important idea. And Gladding talks about that on page 234 of this text. Another thought that Philip Guerin did in his demonstration on the video on psychotherapy.net was talking directly to the counselor. Philip wouldn't usually link the family members to each other. He would talk to one family member, and so they would be able to talk about the issue, even if they're almost talking about the other people as if they weren't there, the other family members, when they were. But then he'd switch to the other and say, oh, okay, so what are your thoughts about what was just said there? But the folks would always remain just between those two. And Philip didn't talk about this directly, but I kind of saw that this might be a way of encouraging differentiation. So not linking the family members to then have them get caught up in the emotional reactiveness that they usually do at home, but maybe having the counselor be the eyes on the counselor between each member of the family first, allows the others to have to sit and reflect and sit on their emotional reaction. So it's almost encouraging them to practice. I'm not responding right away. So maybe I can think about how I'm feeling for a moment before I react. So that could be a way of, the technique of having the counselor be talking to the counselor rather than linking, could be a way of doing that. That does kind of bring in more of like an individualistic cultural lens of kind of the one-on-one work rather than the systems work. But it could give enough emotional distance for the real issues to surface without getting caught up into them. So switching to the role of the counselor in Bowen, according to Gladding, he reported that the counselor is often encouraged to be kind of a calm and neutral presence. And they themselves, the counselor really needs to think about their personhood, their transgenerational patterns, and are they differentiated from their family of origin? Are they still caught up in the emotional patterns of their family of origin? So would those just then begin to be played out with the family that's sitting in front of them? So it's really encouraged that the counselor needs to do their own work. And as they do that, then they can become the coach and the teacher to the family to help them see these dynamics and be able to process them. And it's almost like they're a detective of sorts. Gladding talked about looking for clues into some of these patterns. So the counselor can be like a detective and noticing what are these clues or these breadcrumbs to notice these intergenerational patterns in this family. And so if the Bowen family counselor was successful, they might help the family understand and change how they respond to those intergenerational patterns. So it might be like a break in the continuation of that process. The family members would likely move towards increased autonomy and differentiation from one another while still staying connected. The Bowen family counselor might see them as more emotionally mature. So they're still emotional, but they can be, able to pause and deeply think about their feelings before getting caught up into them. Sometimes the spousal unit or connection or partner unit would often be emphasized as well, because I guess my lens and interpretation of why is that, if the whether it's, married partners or partners, whatever the arrangement, if they can work on their relationship and their intergenerational patterns, then there can be a discontinuation of some of the negative patterns passed on to the next generation. So that spousal unit is really important, or that partner unit is really important. So those are some of the basics of Bowen. And once again, this is kind of a quick brief overview, but to kind of hopefully give some ideas of what are these theories, what are some of the central tenets, some of the central techniques. And if you're interested, it's usually best to begin exploring more and going to some of the founders of the theories to learn more. Thanks.